In the winter of 1980, in a quiet Nebraska town where nothing extraordinary ever happened, a woman vanished without a trace. Her name was Dorothy Silzel, but everyone who loved her called her Dottie. She was 63 years old, a grandmother, a widow, and according to everyone who knew her, she was the kind of woman who would never leave without saying goodbye. But on that cold February morning, Dottie's house sat empty. Her coffee cup was still on the kitchen table. Her reading glasses rested on an open Bible. Her coat hung by the door, and Dottie was gone. For 43 years, her family searched for answers. For 43 years, they buried empty questions instead of closure. And for 43 years, someone in that small town kept a terrible secret. This is the story of how that secret finally came to light. This is the story of justice delayed but not denied. This is the story of Dorothy Dottie Silzel. If this story moves you, if it makes you think about the people in your own life who deserve justice, I need you to do something right now. Share this video. Subscribe to this channel. Because stories like Dottie's only get told when people like you refuse to let them be forgotten. Hit that subscribe button now, before you forget. I promise you, by the end of this, you'll understand why Dottie's story matters more than you can imagine. Let me take you back to the beginning, to a time before the tragedy, before the mystery, before the decades of silence. Let me tell you who Dottie Silzel really was. Dorothy was born in 1916 in rural Nebraska, the third of 7 children in a family that knew more about hard work than luxury. Her father was a farmer, her mother a seamstress who took in mending from neighbors to make ends meet. From the time she could walk, Dottie learned that nothing in life came easy, and that the things worth having were the things you fought for. She grew up during the Great Depression, watching her parents stretch every dollar, watching her mother make soup from scraps and clothing from flour sacks. But despite the hardship, or maybe because of it, Dottie developed an unshakable optimism. She believed that goodness existed in people, that kindness was never wasted, and that family was the foundation upon which everything else was built. At 19, she married Harold Silzel, a quiet man with strong hands and a gentle heart. Harold worked at the local grain elevator, coming home each evening covered in dust, but never too tired to sit on the porch with his young bride and talk about their dreams. They wanted children, a house of their own, a life built on love and honest work. And slowly, steadily, they built exactly that. They had 4 children together, 3 boys and a girl. The house they bought wasn't fancy, just a modest 2-bedroom place on the edge of town, but Dottie made it a home. She sewed curtains for every window, planted flowers along the walkway, and kept a pot of coffee perpetually warm for any neighbor who might stop by. Everyone in town knew Dottie's door was always open. She was the woman you called when you needed a casserole for a funeral, when you needed someone to watch your children in an emergency, when you just needed a listening ear and a cup of something warm. She taught Sunday school at the Lutheran Church for 30 years, watching generations of children grow up and have children of their own. She remembered every birthday, every graduation, every wedding. She sent cards and cookies and handwritten notes that people kept for decades. Harold passed away in 1975, and something in Dottie dimmed. They had been married for 40 years, and suddenly she was alone in that little house where they had raised their family. Her children, now grown with families of their own, worried about her. They took turns calling every evening, stopping by on weekends, making sure she was eating, making sure she wasn't letting grief consume her. But Dottie was resilient. She had survived the Depression, survived the war years when Harold was overseas, survived the normal tragedies that life delivers to everyone who lives long enough. She would survive this too. By 1980, Dottie had found her rhythm again. She volunteered at the church, visited shut-ins from her congregation, and spent as much time as possible with her grandchildren. She was particularly close to her youngest grandchild, a girl named Sarah who was only 7 years old. Sarah would later tell investigators that her grandmother had promised to teach her to make pie crust that spring, that they had plans, that her grandmother never broke a promise. That promise would never be kept. February in Nebraska is brutal. The wind cuts through you, the snow piles high, and people stay indoors unless they have good reason to venture out. Dottie was no different. She kept her excursions brief during the coldest months, just quick trips to the grocery store or church. She lived simply, needed little, and found contentment in small things: a good book, a phone call from her daughter, the cardinals that visited her bird feeder despite the cold. On February 15, 1980, Dottie's daughter Linda called to check on her mother, as she did every evening. The phone rang and rang, but no one answered. Linda assumed her mother had stepped next door, maybe to borrow something from the neighbors, maybe to take them some of the cookies she had mentioned baking. But when Linda called again an hour later, there was still no answer. By 10 o'clock that night, Linda's worry had transformed into panic. She called her brothers, and together they drove the 30 miles to their mother's house. What they found when they arrived was a puzzle with no solution. The house was unlocked, which was unusual but not unheard of in that small town where crime was something that happened elsewhere. Dottie's purse sat on the kitchen counter, her wallet inside with cash and cards untouched. Her car was in the garage. Her medication, which she took for blood pressure, sat in the cabinet. The only thing missing was Dottie herself. The family searched through the night. They checked the church, the homes of friends, the small hospital 2 towns over. They walked the fields surrounding her property with flashlights, calling her name into the darkness. When dawn broke, gray and cold, they called the sheriff. And the investigation that should have brought answers only brought more questions. The sheriff who responded to that first call was a man named Eugene Fletcher, a lifelong resident of the county who had known Dottie Silzel for years. He had been one of her Sunday school students, back when he was a gap-toothed boy with dirty fingernails and a tendency toward mischief. Dottie had been patient with him then, had seen potential in him that others missed. Now he stood in her empty kitchen, his own hands shaking slightly as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. In a town where the most serious crimes were usually teenagers tipping cows or stealing beer from the convenience store, a missing elderly woman was unprecedented. Eugene didn't have a playbook for this. None of them did. The initial investigation moved slowly, hampered by inexperience and the assumption that Dottie would turn up. Elderly people wandered sometimes, didn't they? Maybe she had become confused, walked off into the fields, succumbed to the cold. Search parties were organized, volunteers from the church and the community trudging through snow that was sometimes waist-deep. They searched for 3 days, covering every inch of ground within a 5-mile radius of Dottie's home. They found nothing. No footprints leading away from the house. No disturbed snow. No sign that anyone had left that property on foot. Linda Silzel refused to accept the implied narrative. Her mother wasn't confused, wasn't the type to wander. Something had happened to her, something deliberate, something terrible. She pushed the sheriff to investigate further, to treat this as what it clearly was, a crime. But Eugene Fletcher was in over his head, and perhaps he knew it. He brought in the state police, who conducted interviews with neighbors, with members of Dottie's church, with anyone who had seen her in the days before she vanished. The picture that emerged was of a woman with no enemies, no conflicts, no reason for anyone to wish her harm. Dottie had lived a quiet, virtuous life. She didn't have money worth stealing. She didn't have secrets worth protecting. She was exactly what she appeared to be, a kind old woman who had spent her life serving others. So why would someone want to hurt her? But as the investigation deepened, small inconsistencies began to surface. Dottie's neighbor, a man named Richard Hawkins, had been oddly evasive during his interview. He claimed he hadn't seen or heard anything unusual, but his story seemed rehearsed, too smooth, too perfect. He had lived next door to Dottie for 8 years, close enough to see who came and went, close enough to notice if something was wrong. Yet he claimed to know nothing. Richard Hawkins was 45 years old in 1980, a bachelor who worked as a mechanic at the local auto shop. He was known around town as a quiet man, solitary, the type who kept to himself and didn't invite questions. Some people found him odd, but odd wasn't criminal. He attended church sporadically, waved to neighbors when he saw them, and generally avoided the social fabric that defined small-town life. No one knew much about his past, and he seemed to prefer it that way. Linda had never liked him. She couldn't explain why exactly. There was something in the way he looked at her mother sometimes, something that made her uncomfortable. Once, She had arrived to find Richard sitting at her mother's kitchen table, drinking coffee like he belonged there. Dottie had brushed off her daughter's concern, said Richard was just lonely, that she felt sorry for him. That was Dottie's way, seeing the best in people, extending grace to those others overlooked. But Linda had seen the way Richard watched her mother when he thought no one was looking, and it made her skin crawl. Now, with her mother missing, Linda told investigators about her suspicions. They interviewed Richard again, more intensively this time. His alibi checked out. He had been at work until 6 o'clock on the evening Dottie disappeared, and several co-workers confirmed this. After that, he claimed he had gone straight home, watched television, and gone to bed early. No one could contradict this, but no one could confirm it either. The weeks stretched into months. Spring came, melting the snow, revealing nothing. Summer passed with its long days and warm nights, and still there was no sign of Dottie Silzel. By fall, the active investigation had essentially ended. There were no leads, no evidence, no witnesses. The case went cold, filed away with the other unsolved mysteries that every small town accumulates over time. For Dottie's family, the lack of answers was its own form of torture. They couldn't grieve properly because they didn't know what had happened. They couldn't move on because there was nothing to move on from. Linda, in particular, was consumed by the need to know. She hired a private investigator, spending money she didn't have on a search that yielded nothing. She wrote letters to newspapers, to television stations, to anyone who might help keep her mother's story alive. She became an advocate for other families of missing persons, channeling her grief into activism. But none of it brought her mother home. And through it all, Richard Hawkins remained next door to the house where Dottie had lived. After a year, the family sold the property. They couldn't bear to enter it anymore, couldn't stand the sight of her empty chair, her unwashed coffee cup preserved like a relic. The new owners, a young couple from out of state, had no idea of the home's history. They painted the walls, replaced the curtains Dottie had sewn, planted new flowers over the ones she had tended. Life went on, as it always does, regardless of the wounds it leaves behind. I want you to think about something for a moment. Think about the people in your life who seem off, who raise flags that you can't quite explain. We're conditioned to be polite, to give people the benefit of the doubt, to tell ourselves we're being paranoid. But what if we're not? What if our instincts are trying to tell us something our minds refuse to accept? Let me know in the comments. Have you ever had a gut feeling about someone that later turned out to be right? I think you'll find, as Dottie's family did, that our instincts know things our rational minds refuse to believe. Richard Hawkins sold his property in 1985 and moved away. No one knew where he went, and no one much cared. He was just another face that passed through town, unremarkable, forgettable. The case of Dorothy Silzel faded from public memory, preserved only in the hearts of those who loved her and in dusty files that no one opened anymore. Decades passed. The world changed in ways Dottie Silzel could never have imagined. The children she had taught in Sunday school grew old themselves, had grandchildren, retired from jobs that hadn't existed when she was alive. The town where she had lived transformed too. Old buildings torn down, new ones built. The rhythm of small-town life altered by technology and progress and the relentless march of time. But some things remained constant. Linda Silzel never stopped looking for answers. And somewhere, tucked away in a banker's box in a state archive, the evidence from Dottie's case waited, patient as the dead, for someone to remember. Linda was 72 years old in 2018 when she received a phone call that changed everything. On the other end of the line was a detective named Maria Santos, a young woman who worked for a cold case unit that hadn't even existed when Dottie disappeared. Maria had stumbled upon the Silzel case while researching another investigation and had become obsessed with it. Something about Dottie's story called to her, demanded attention, refused to be ignored. She told Linda that she wanted to reopen the case, to apply modern investigative techniques to the old evidence. She couldn't promise results, but she could promise to try. For Linda, it was the first real hope she had felt in nearly 40 years. She had never given up, not really, but the weight of those years had worn her down. She was tired in ways that sleep couldn't fix, exhausted by decades of not knowing. Now, finally, someone else cared. Someone else saw what she had always seen, that her mother's disappearance was a crime that deserved to be solved. Maria Santos was not what Linda expected. She was young, barely 35, with a sharpness in her eyes that suggested she had seen more of human darkness than someone her age should. She had joined the police force straight out of college, worked her way up through the ranks, and had landed in the cold case unit 3 years earlier. It was unglamorous work, sifting through old files, chasing leads that had gone cold decades ago. But Maria loved it. She believed that the dead deserved voices, that time shouldn't be allowed to erase crimes, that justice delayed was still justice. The evidence from Dottie's case was sparse, but not hopeless. There was the coffee cup, preserved in an evidence bag, its contents long since evaporated, but the cup itself still potentially viable for fingerprint analysis. There were the photographs taken of the scene, grainy and faded, but showing details that fresh eyes might interpret differently. There were the interview transcripts, the statements from neighbors and family members, the official record of an investigation that had gone nowhere. And there was Richard Hawkins, whose name appeared throughout the file, always on the periphery, never quite a suspect, never quite cleared. Maria began with Richard. She traced his movements after he left Nebraska, following a paper trail that took her through Kansas, Oklahoma, and finally to a small town in Texas where Richard had died in 2001. He was 66 years old when he passed, alone, his death unnoticed for 3 days until a neighbor called the police about a smell. He had no family, no friends, no one to mourn him. His belongings were sold at auction, his house bulldozed to make way for a parking lot. Richard Hawkins had lived and died without making a mark on the world. But dead men can still tell secrets. Maria obtained Richard's death records, his employment history, his limited financial documents. She found nothing directly incriminating, but she found patterns. Richard had moved frequently throughout his life, never staying anywhere for more than a few years. He had worked odd jobs, always in auto repair, always for small businesses that kept minimal records. He had never married, never formed lasting relationships, never put down roots. It was the profile of someone hiding, running, staying one step ahead of something he didn't want to catch up with him. Maria also discovered something the original investigators had missed. Before moving to Nebraska, Richard Hawkins had lived in Iowa, in a town where a woman had disappeared in 1971. Her name was Margaret Powell. She was 58 years old, and she had never been found. The cases were eerily similar. An elderly woman living alone, a quiet neighbor, a disappearance without explanation. But the Iowa investigators had never connected the dots, and neither had anyone else. Now Maria was seeing a picture that made her blood run cold. Richard Hawkins hadn't been odd or lonely. He had been a predator, selecting victims who were vulnerable, isolated, unlikely to be missed immediately. Dottie Silzel had been his second victim, perhaps not his last. Armed with this new theory, Maria went back to the physical evidence. The coffee cup from Dottie's kitchen had never been tested for DNA. In 1980, DNA evidence didn't exist in any practical sense. But now it was routine. Maria submitted the cup to the state crime lab, along with other items that had been preserved, hoping against hope that something had survived the decades. While she waited for results, Maria did something that would prove crucial. She tracked down the current owner of Richard Hawkins's former property in Nebraska. The land had changed hands several times, but it was now owned by an elderly farmer named Thomas Brennan, who had purchased it in 1995 as an expansion of his existing holdings. He had torn down the old house years ago, but he hadn't done much with the land itself. It was mostly fields now, used for growing corn and soybeans. Maria asked Thomas if he had ever noticed anything unusual about the property, anything that seemed out of place. Thomas thought for a long moment before remembering something. When he had first bought the land, before tearing down the house, he had noticed that the basement floor was uneven. One section, in the far corner, was slightly raised, as if it had been poured at a different time than the rest. He had assumed it was just shoddy construction. He had never thought about it again. Until now. Maria Santos stood at the edge of Thomas Brennan's field on a morning in late September, watching a team of forensic archaeologists carefully section off the area where Richard Hawkins's house had once stood. The basement had been filled in with dirt and debris when the house was demolished, but the foundation walls remained, buried just beneath the surface. And in that far corner, beneath a layer of concrete that had been poured sometime after the house was originally built, the ground-penetrating radar had detected an anomaly. Something was buried there. Something approximately the size and shape of a human body. Linda Silzel was there too, supported by her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, for generations of a family that had never stopped searching, never stopped hoping, never stopped believing that someday, somehow, they would bring Dottie home. Linda was 83 years old now, frail in body but fierce in spirit. She had waited 43 years for this moment. She would not miss it. The excavation took 3 days. The forensic team worked slowly, methodically, treating every inch of soil as a potential clue. They documented everything with photographs and video, preserved samples for later analysis, and maintained a chain of custody that would be unbreakable if this ever went to trial. Not that there would be a trial, not with Richard Hawkins long dead. But justice takes many forms, and Maria was determined to give the Silzel family every form that remained available. On the 3rd day, the team found bones. Human bones, buried approximately 4 feet below the surface, encased in what appeared to be a plastic tarp that had deteriorated badly over the decades. The remains were fragmentary, damaged by time and soil chemistry, but they were unmistakably human, and they were unmistakably female. The forensic anthropologist on site made preliminary observations. The skeleton belonged to an adult female, approximately 60 to 70 years of age at death. There was evidence of perimortem trauma, injuries sustained at or around the time of death, specifically to the skull. This was not a natural death. This was not an accident. This was murder. DNA extraction from 43-year-old remains is difficult but not impossible. The state crime lab worked for weeks, trying to isolate viable genetic material from the degraded bones. Meanwhile, Maria obtained DNA samples from Dottie's surviving relatives, including Linda, for comparison. The waiting was agonizing, each day stretching into eternity as the family held their breath, hoping and dreading in equal measure. The results came back in November, just as the first snow of winter began to fall. The DNA was a match. The remains found buried beneath Richard Hawkins's basement floor belonged to Dorothy Dottie Silzel. After 43 years, she had been found. The news spread through the small Nebraska town like wildfire. People who remembered Dottie wept openly, their grief mixed with relief that the mystery was finally solved. The church where she had taught Sunday school held a special service in her memory, the pews packed with people whose lives she had touched. The local newspaper ran a front-page story, complete with old photographs showing Dottie as a young woman, as a mother, as the grandmother everyone remembered. For Linda Silzel, the news was both a mercy and a fresh wound. She had known, in her heart, that her mother was dead. You don't disappear for 43 years and turn up alive. But knowing it intellectually and having it confirmed by science are different things. Now there was no room for hope, however irrational, however desperate. Her mother was gone, had been gone all along, murdered by a man who had lived next door and smiled at them in the grocery store. The cause of death was officially determined to be blunt force trauma to the head. Dottie had been struck multiple times with a heavy object, likely a hammer or similar tool. The attack had been brutal, the wounds suggesting rage or panic or both. She had not died quickly, but she had died alone, at the hands of someone she had trusted, someone she had welcomed into her home because she saw good in everyone, even when there was none to find. Richard Hawkins could not be prosecuted. The dead cannot be brought to trial, cannot be confronted with their crimes, cannot be made to answer for the lives they destroyed. But Maria Santos was determined to build a case anyway, to document every piece of evidence, to leave a record that would stand as proof of what had happened. It was the least she could do for Dottie, for Linda, for all the people who had spent decades wondering. As she dug deeper into Richard's past, Maria discovered more connections. The woman in Iowa, Margaret Powell, remained missing, her case still open. But Maria found another case in Kansas, Another elderly woman who had vanished without a trace in 1978, just a year before Richard moved to Nebraska. Her name was Helen Foster, and she had lived alone in a small house on the edge of town. Richard had worked at an auto shop 2 miles from her home. She had never been found. The pattern was undeniable. Richard Hawkins had spent his adult life preying on vulnerable women, killing them, burying them, and moving on before anyone suspected. How many victims had there been? Maria couldn't say for certain. She suspected at least 3, possibly more. She shared her findings with law enforcement in Iowa and Kansas, hoping they would reopen their cold cases, hoping that more families might find the closure that had eluded them for so long. The memorial service for Dorothy Silzel was held on a crisp December morning, exactly 43 years and 10 months after she had vanished. The Lutheran church where she had taught Sunday school was filled to capacity, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the foyer. They came from across the country, her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, former Sunday school students now in their 60s, neighbors who had moved away decades ago, but never forgotten the woman who had welcomed them with coffee and kindness. Linda Silzel spoke first, her voice steady despite the tears that streamed down her weathered face. She talked about her mother's strength, her faith, her unwavering belief in the goodness of people. She talked about the decades of searching, the frustration, the moments of despair when she had wanted to give up. And she talked about gratitude, for Maria Santos who had refused to let the case stay cold, for the forensic team who had worked with such care and dedication, for everyone who had kept her mother's memory alive through the long years of not knowing. Her words were powerful, her grief palpable, but there was something else in her voice too. There was peace. Not the peace of forgetting, not the peace of moving on, but the peace of finally knowing. After 43 years, she could stop searching. She could stop wondering. She could finally, truly, grieve. The service concluded with the burial of Dottie's remains next to her husband Harold, in the small cemetery on the edge of town where generations of the family rested. The headstone, newly carved, bore a simple inscription: Dorothy Dottie Silzel, 1916 to 1980, beloved mother, grandmother, friend. She had waited 43 years to be laid to rest. Now, finally, she was home. But the story didn't end there. In the weeks following the memorial service, Maria Santos continued her investigation, determined to understand not just what had happened but why. She interviewed people who had known Richard Hawkins, tracked down distant relatives who might have insight into his psychology, and consulted with criminal profilers who specialized in serial predators. What emerged was a portrait of a man shaped by violence and abandonment. Richard had been born in 1935 in rural Oklahoma, the son of a farmhand and a mother who had left when he was 3 years old. His father was an alcoholic, prone to rages, quick with his fists. Richard had learned early that the world was a dangerous place, that people who seemed kind could turn cruel without warning. He had learned to be invisible, to watch, to wait. There were reports of concerning behavior even in childhood. Neighbors remembered him torturing animals, setting fires, stealing from other children. But in those days, in that place, such behavior was dismissed as boyish mischief. No one intervened. No one got him help. He grew into adulthood with his darkness intact, unseen, unchecked. His first known victim was Margaret Powell in Iowa. He was 36 years old then, working at a garage near her home. She had brought her car in for repairs, had been kind to him, had made small talk while he worked. Perhaps that kindness was what attracted him. Perhaps he saw vulnerability in it, an opportunity he couldn't resist. He killed her and buried her somewhere that has never been found. Then he moved on. Helen Foster in Kansas was next, then Dottie Silzel in Nebraska. Each time, the pattern was the same. He found work, identified a target, befriended her, and then killed her when the moment was right. He was careful, patient, controlled. He left no witnesses, no evidence, nothing to connect him to the crimes. He was, in many ways, the perfect predator. What finally stopped him wasn't justice but time. By the mid-1980s, Richard was 50 years old, his health beginning to fail. He moved to Texas, stopped working, lived on disability payments and the little money he had saved. There's no evidence he killed again after leaving Nebraska. Perhaps he was too weak. Perhaps the urge had faded. Perhaps he simply ran out of opportunities. Maria's report on Richard Hawkins was submitted to multiple law enforcement agencies, along with recommendations for reopening the cases of Margaret Powell and Helen Foster. Whether those cases would be solved remained uncertain, but at least now there was a suspect, a thread that investigators could follow. It wasn't much, but it was something. For Maria, the Silzel case was both a triumph and a reminder. A triumph because she had brought closure to a family that had waited decades for answers. A reminder because justice in its purest form, the conviction and punishment of a guilty man, remained forever out of reach. Richard Hawkins had escaped that fate, dying alone but free, never held accountable for the lives he had destroyed. But there are other forms of justice. There is the justice of truth being known, of victims being named, of stories being told. There is the justice of families finally being able to grieve. There is the justice of a community coming together to remember and to honor. And in these forms, at least, justice had been served. In the months following the resolution of her mother's case, Linda Silzel found herself in an unexpected role. She became an advocate, a voice for other families whose loved ones had vanished without explanation. She spoke at conferences, gave interviews to media outlets, and lobbied state legislators for increased funding for cold case units. At 83 years old, she had more energy than people half her age, driven by a mission that gave her purpose. She often thought about what her mother would think of all this. Dottie had never sought attention, had lived her life in quiet service to others. She would probably be embarrassed by all the fuss, by the newspaper articles and television segments, by the strangers who recognized her daughter on the street and offered condolences. But Linda knew her mother would also understand. Some things were bigger than personal comfort. Some things demanded to be said. Linda's message was simple: never give up. The technology that solved her mother's case hadn't existed in 1980. Who knows what advances the future will bring? Families should preserve evidence, maintain records, keep their loved ones' stories alive. Because someday, somehow, answers might come. It had taken 43 years for Dottie Silzel, but answers had come. They could come for others too. She also spoke about the human cost of unsolved cases. Not just the victim, but the ripples of pain that spread outward through families, through communities, through generations. Her own children had grown up in the shadow of their grandmother's disappearance. They had watched their mother consumed by grief and determination, had felt her absence even at moments that should have been purely joyful. Graduations, weddings, the births of children and grandchildren, all were colored by the missing piece, the grandmother who should have been there but wasn't. Now, finally, that shadow was lifting. Linda's children spoke of feeling lighter, of being able to think about their grandmother without the accompanying weight of mystery. The grandchildren who had never known Dottie but had grown up hearing stories about her felt connected to her in a new way. She was no longer just a name, just a face in old photographs. She was real, her story complete, her memory preserved. The impact extended beyond the Silzel family. In the town where Dottie had lived, there was a renewed sense of community, of connection, of shared history. The local historical society created an exhibit about the case, displaying photographs, newspaper clippings, and items that had belonged to Dottie. Schools invited Maria Santos to speak to students about the importance of forensic science and the pursuit of justice. The story of Dorothy Silzel became a lesson, a reminder, a warning. Not all the attention was positive. There were those who questioned whether it was appropriate to dwell on such dark events, whether the focus on Richard Hawkins gave him a kind of notoriety he didn't deserve. But Linda countered these objections with a simple truth. The story wasn't about Richard Hawkins. It was about her mother. It was about a woman who had lived a good life, who had made a difference in her community, and who had died at the hands of someone who saw her only as a victim. Remembering Dottie was not about elevating Richard. It was about refusing to let her be forgotten. Maria Santos, for her part, continued her work with the cold case unit. The Silzel case had brought her a measure of recognition, but she remained focused on the cases yet unsolved, the families still waiting. She kept a photograph of Dottie on her desk, a reminder of why the work mattered, of what could be achieved with persistence and technology, and a refusal to accept that some crimes were simply unsolvable. She thought often about the other potential victims, Margaret Powell and Helen Foster, whose remains had never been found. Were there others? Richard Hawkins had been active for at least a decade, possibly longer. Serial predators rarely stop on their own. Somewhere, probably in multiple locations, there were other families living with the same uncertainty that had plagued the Silzels for 43 years. Maria couldn't bring Richard Hawkins to justice, but she could keep looking, keep digging, keep searching for the truth. It was all she could offer, but it was everything she had. 2 years after Dottie Silzel's remains were finally laid to rest, an unexpected development breathed new life into the investigation of Richard Hawkins's potential victims. A man named James Hawkins, Richard's nephew, reached out to Maria Santos with information that had been kept secret within his family for decades. James was 68 years old, a retired teacher living in Arizona. He had never been close to his uncle, had in fact actively avoided him throughout his childhood. But he remembered things, disturbing things, that he had never told anyone until he saw the news coverage of the Silzel case. When James was 12 years old, he had spent a summer with his uncle in Oklahoma. Richard was 25 then, already exhibiting the behaviors that would define his life. James remembered Richard taking him to an abandoned barn on the outskirts of town, showing him something buried in the dirt floor. At the time, James didn't understand what he was seeing. It was just shapes, just objects, indistinct and frightening in the dim light. But Richard had smiled, had told him it was their secret, had warned him never to tell anyone. For over 50 years, James had kept that secret. He had buried it so deep that he almost convinced himself it hadn't happened. But the Silzel case brought it all back, the fear, the confusion, the sick feeling in his stomach when he realized what his uncle had probably been showing him. Maria listened to James's account with growing horror. If what he was saying was true, Richard Hawkins had been killing years earlier than anyone suspected. The Oklahoma barn had been demolished decades ago, the land now covered by a housing development. But Maria coordinated with local authorities to search the area, using the same ground-penetrating radar that had found Dottie Silzel. They found remains. Human remains, buried beneath what was now someone's backyard, preserved by the same clay soil that had once formed the floor of an abandoned barn. The victim was female, approximately 30 years old at death, and had been buried for at least 50 years. Identification took months. DNA technology is powerful, but it requires comparison samples, and many potential matches were either dead themselves or unaware of the databases that existed for such comparisons. Eventually, the remains were matched to a woman named Susan Bradley, who had disappeared from Oklahoma in 1961. She had been 28 years old, a waitress at a local diner, and she had last been seen accepting a ride home from a man whose description matched Richard Hawkins. The Silzel case had led to the Bradley case, which in turn led to renewed investigations in multiple states. Cold case units from Oklahoma to Texas to Iowa began re-examining unsolved disappearances, looking for any connection to Richard Hawkins, any pattern that might indicate his involvement. It was painstaking work, much of it ultimately fruitless. But sometimes a connection was found. A victim was identified. A family received the answers they had long stopped hoping for. Linda Silzel followed these developments with a mixture of sorrow and satisfaction. Sorrow for the other victims, the other families, the breadth of destruction that Richard Hawkins had left in his wake. Satisfaction that her mother's case had sparked a chain of discoveries, that Dottie's death, senseless as it was, had led to something meaningful. She thought about her mother often, wondered what Dottie would make of it all. Her mother had believed in redemption, in the power of good to overcome evil. Perhaps this was a form of that. Evil being confronted even after the perpetrator's death, truth emerging from decades of silence. It wasn't the redemption Dottie had probably imagined, but it was redemption nonetheless. At 85 years old, Linda knew her own time was limited. She had lived to see her mother found, to see justice served in whatever imperfect form was available. It was more than she had dared to hope for during those long decades of searching. Whatever time she had left, she would spend in gratitude, in love, in the company of the family that Dottie had helped to build. On a warm spring morning, exactly 46 years after Dottie Silzel had vanished, Linda Silzel stood before a crowd gathered in the Nebraska town where her mother had lived and died. Behind her, a newly dedicated memorial garden bloomed with flowers, the same varieties Dottie had planted along her walkway so many years ago. At the center of the garden stood a stone marker, bearing not just Dottie's name, but the names of all Richard Hawkins's known victims, a permanent reminder of lives lost and a promise that they would never be forgotten. Linda spoke of her mother with a voice that had grown thin with age but remained strong with conviction. She spoke of faith and perseverance, of darkness and light, of the belief that truth will eventually emerge no matter how deeply it is buried. She spoke of gratitude for Maria Santos and the forensic team, for James Hawkins and his courage in coming forward, for everyone who had refused to let the victims become mere statistics. And she spoke of hope, hope that the remaining victims would someday be found, hope that other families would find the closure that had eluded them, hope that the world was becoming a place where predators could not hide forever, where technology and determination would eventually shine light into every shadow. The audience listened in silence, many of them weeping openly. Among them were members of the other victims' families, brought together by shared tragedy and shared resolve. Susan Bradley's sister was there, 72 years old now, finally able to visit the grave of a sister she had last seen when she was 6. Representatives from the Iowa and Kansas cold case units attended, committed to solving the remaining mysteries. Maria Santos stood near the front, her work on the Silzel case long since completed, but her connection to the family enduring. After Linda finished speaking, the crowd dispersed slowly, many lingering in the memorial garden, touching the stone marker, reading the names of women whose lives had been cut short by violence. The garden would be maintained by the local historical society, a living tribute to the dead, a place of reflection and remembrance. Linda walked through the garden one last time, touching the petals of flowers her mother had loved, breathing in scents that carried her back to childhood. She thought about the long journey that had brought her here, the decades of pain and uncertainty, the eventual triumph of truth over silence. It hadn't been the life she had imagined for herself, but it had been a life of purpose, of meaning, of love. She visited her mother's grave before leaving town. The headstone was no longer new, the edges beginning to soften with weather and time. But the inscription remained clear: Dorothy Dottie Silzel, 1916 to 1980, beloved mother, grandmother, friend. And beneath it, added after the discovery, a new line, finally home. Linda knelt before the stone, her aged knees protesting, and placed a single flower on the earth. She stayed there for a long time, saying nothing, needing no words. Everything that needed to be said had been said. Everything that needed to be done had been done. When she finally rose, she felt something she hadn't felt in 46 years. Not happiness exactly, not peace precisely, but something close to both. Something that felt like completion. Dottie Silzel had lived a life of quiet service, touching countless lives in ways she never knew. Her death had been senseless, her burial secret, her memory nearly erased by time. But in the end, her story had been told. Her truth had been spoken. Her name had been cleared. And in that small Nebraska town, in a memorial garden planted with her favorite flowers, surrounded by the descendants who carried her blood and her legacy, Dorothy Dottie Silzel would live on forever. The story of Dottie Silzel is not just a story of tragedy. It is a story of perseverance, of love that transcends time, of justice that arrives even when it seems impossible. It is a reminder that every person matters, that every life deserves to be remembered, that evil may hide, but it cannot hide forever. If this story has moved you, if it has made you think about the unsolved mysteries in your own community, the families still waiting for answers, I ask you to do one thing. Share this video. Tell others about Dottie Silzel. Keep her memory alive. Because when we remember the victims, when we tell their stories, we declare that their lives mattered, And that is the most powerful form of justice there is. Rest in peace, Dorothy Dottie Silzel. You are finally home.